In the previous episode, we saw how the roots of civilization came from an evolution in the hunting and gathering strategy of our ancient ancestors. How they built towers as spotting platforms, from which they could look out for the megafauna they relied on, with permanent settlements developing around these ancient skyscrapers. In this episode, we will continue to focus on the town of Jericho, as a representation of all such communities in the region. This time, we will look at what happened when the megafauna disappeared and the Younger Dryas came to an end. How once again, humanity had to change with the world, and these changes would affect humanity forever. For hundreds of years, the watchtower had served the people of Jericho, with youngsters calling out when they spotted signs of prey in the area. However, as the environment became unsettled with the end of the Younger Dryas, the prey humans depended upon had disappeared. The days when huge animals regularly migrated through the area was gone. Now, the settlement was left relying on smaller animals. This made traditional hunting practices all but useless. Just having a set of eyes on top of a 4-story tower was no longer enough to scout out enough prey to support the growing community. However, as meat resources became diminished and the atmosphere became warmer and more prone to storms, neither was it possible to blindly send out scouting parties. They needed a new way to get meat, without a greater cost in manpower and energy. Fortunately, certain people already had experience in the type of hunting they needed. In fact, humans had utilized such hunting techniques for around 20,000 years by this point. It would be impossible to know if hunting with dogs had always gone on in Jericho, was reinvented by the local inhabitants, or whether nomadic hunters were still settling in the city, bringing their skills with them. However, it does seem that the latter is the most likely. Not only does the presence of dogs make sense for the time and location, archaeologists have discovered fragments of dog bone dating from the Neolithic, something of a rarity for the period, as the region doesn't have the best environment for the long-term preservation of such material. This would have greatly altered the dynamics and social order. Previously, everyone would have held equal standing, with everyone having similar, overlapping responsibilities, and so everyone was doing a similar mix of work. But when the vast majority of people are doing a task that is relatively easy to be trained in, such as farming, while a few have what must have seemed an almost magical command over an animal, then those few become quite important to that community, especially if they provide a service the community cannot do without. This disparity between the people of the community would only become greater. It was around this time that we see the domestication of certain birds, particularly the chicken and the pigeon. The latter was particularly useful and easy to breed, as it was easy to feed, would return home despite flying considerable distances, and its chicks grow surprisingly large, making them an ideal food source. Ancient people began to build towers that look strangely familiar, to house pigeons and doves. It is also believed that these birds were soon trained to do other tasks, such as spotting and racing. This shows the level of understanding certain specialists must have had with these animals. Now, this falls into the realm of speculation. But, if you have a high number of pigeons and doves around, you're probably going to draw the attention of hunters, such as the sparrowhawk and the eagle. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the help I received from Emma Raphael, of Raphael Historic Falconry, who had this to say on the subject.
Hawking developed from observation. Man was only interested in those raptor species, which caught prey he also wanted to eat. Early man would only have witnessed species of raptor, which hunted and caught prey at ground level, and within physical sight of him. It would have been a woodland hunter, something low-flying, not terribly fast, something that didn't fly a long way, and something a human could capably follow. Academics agree that it was the hawk or accipiter family, which humans likely first trained, and I agree. Ironically, they are the most difficult raptors to handle, but everything they catch is edible. Based on that analysis, the eagle family may well have been an early candidate too, and indeed in the mountainous regions of Asia, eagle hawking can be traced back a very long way.
Now, if we assume pigeons, doves, and chickens were already in abundance in Jericho and similar sites, as indicated in both archaeology and recovered engravings at sites around the region, it would be expected that such raptors would have been a regular sight around the settlement. It also stands to reason that those who spent their day observing such animals from the tower, or among them in the search for food, would have been the first to understand these birds. This also just happens to be one of the regions where the first evidence of people using raptors to hunt is found. So, it isn't so much of a leap to presume that those specialists, already armed with a supernatural ability to communicate and command dogs, would be the very people who learned to command birds. Let there be no mistake. For the layman, commanding a dog is one thing, but to command something with the power of flight, such a feat would certainly give such men an almost supernatural quality. To show how much of an impact such a spectacle would have had on the general public, I would like to quote a tale told to me by Emma Raphael. This tale comes from much later, Dark Age England to be exact, but it shows the perceived skill of such huntsmen. Bearing in mind that the Romans had brought falconry to Britain generations before, so it wasn't a new skill to the islands. And yet, they were still so awe-inspiring, that they were deemed worthy enough to put into legends, involving wars and the death of kings.
The 9th century adventurer, Ragnar Lodbrok, was hawking along the Danish coast in a small boat, when he was blown by a storm to England. Ragnar landed in Norfolk, and, because of his skill at hawking and hunting, became a favourite of King Edmund of East Anglia. The king's huntsman, a man called Bern, grew jealous and murdered Ragnar. Bern hid the body, but Ragnar's faithful greyhound kept watch over the corpse of his master, until the crime was discovered. Bern put to sea in Ragnar's boat, but it was blown to Denmark, where it was recognized, and Bern was dragged before Ragnar's sons. He accused King Edmund of the murder, and so Ragnar's sons swore revenge. They raised an army and invaded England, killing the king in cold blood.
If such a sight had the admiration of Dark Age Britons, who probably knew of falconry, what must have been the effect on those who only saw raptors as a threat to their food supplies? These hunters now commanded beasts on land and in the air, to the point where the dogs and the birds appeared to work as a team. Meanwhile, neither the dog or the bird would attack the animals the settlement used for food, even when early pigs and goats were introduced. Who were these men, who have such command over such predators? Who apparently used a special language with dog and bird that no human could understand? Who had learned such strange crafts that allowed him to create traps for any animal? People who were great craftsmen, due to the needs they had while away on the hunt. What a strange sight it must have been for the mostly farming and pastoral community, seeing these men become bigger, with bellies full of meat, with the experience that allowed him to seemingly control nature. They must have thought that the hunters were one with creation, one with the animals they commanded, to the point where they were a divine mixture of man and beast, carrying with them their bags, filled with the treats that kept themselves and their animals fed. They probably returned from long foraging trips, with new ideas, abilities, and goods, gained from contact with other hunters and long-distance traders. They were the ones who would disappear into the unknown, and reappear, with food and new knowledge, while the vast majority of the population would have been in a shrinking world, where increasingly, their experience of the world was limited to the borders of their land. Civilization was not born out of religion, at the expense of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. It was the hunter who led their nomadic tribes to settlement. It was the hunters who learnt about animals, leading not only to using predators, but also pastoral farming. It was hunters who experimented and created. It was the hunters who became the priests. The hunters who became kings. The hunters who became the gods. Remember Odin, who sat in his high chair to observe everything, served by 2 ravens that would fly around the world to bring Odin information. The same Odin who would disappear for weeks, returning with great wisdom, lost knowledge, or great gifts and powers, protected and accompanied by his trusted wolves, not so different to Ragnar, a Norseman, mentioned in the earlier tale. From the primary gods of Egyptian mythology, to the signs of the zodiac, the influence of the hunter and their trusted companions are everywhere. The rise of hunters in society wasn't simply responsible for the development of a class system. It may have vastly changed how societies interact with each other, in ways affecting us to this day. Before this time, there is no evidence of conflict. No walls, no weapons, and few remains showing signs of a violent death. After this time, the first walls of Jericho were built and the signs of conflict are everywhere. Within settlements, everything changed. After the hunters took greater relevance and therefore power, the age of evenly sized homes ends. Instead, we see the majority of general laborers living in smaller and smaller homes, while a new elite took more and more land. Just a few thousand years later, we see signs of mass poverty among a working class, further leading to horrors such as slavery. And it can all be traced back to the time the hunters became the leaders. To end this episode, I'd like to leave you with the words of Emma Raphael one last time, as she explains why she believes hunters would have had such a commanding influence on the course of civilization.
Hunting is such a primeval, survival-critical action, that it undoubtedly affected human evolution, long before religion or farming developed. To be effective, hunting had to be organized, and I think that's the key word. To organize means to effect control, and to control nature was a powerful tool.
Thank you for listening to episode 2 of the Age of Towers trilogy. In episode 3, we will be looking at how tower building spread and influenced the development of our civilization, even up to the present day.